So it is time for us to begin this morning. By the overhead, it should be obvious that we are going to be opening up our Bibles to the text of Jude, which will close out, schedule-wise, our Sunday morning Bible study for the rest of the calendar year as we introduce Jude this morning, and then we'll carefully read through it through the course of December's Bible studies. Before we get into our conversation for today and the time of study, let's go ahead and begin with prayer. So if you would, bow your heads together with me. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the blessings that are found in Jesus. We thank you for the time that we will share in study and reflection. Help us to be, firstly, good students of the message of God, and that we listen well to your word. We're discerning and careful readers, and that we try to not only know what is in your word, but understand it. Help us with our understanding spiritually and give us wisdom. We offer this prayer to you in the name of your Son. Amen. All right, so as noted, we are in Jude. This morning's study is an overview and introduction to the text, trying to frame, if you will, the epistle of Jude in a way that is practical, relevant to our lives in this century, but takes careful attention to how it was initially transmitted, paying attention to some of the details as to when it was written, and how that impacts our appreciation and understanding of the text. So let's go ahead and we're going to read verses 1 and 2 very briefly. We'll actually pay more attention to them next week. But right now, if we could, Bobby, do you have Jude open right now? And if you could, read Jude verses 1 and 2 for us.
Okay, I'm almost to it.
That's fine. Just verses 1 and 2.
See with the silver of Jesus Christ and brother James, to them that are sanctified by God the Father and preserved in Jesus Christ and called. Mercy unto you and peace and love be multiplied.
All right, so those first two verses were given a couple of important clues or indicators as to the background of the text. It helps us understand by declaration who our author is, by connection who they are related to, and certainly gives us some intent on the audience. Those things are always important when you're paying attention to any written literature. That is, knowing who wrote it, who they are connected to. Also, often the introductions will tell us who they're writing towards, what their context is. And that will shift the way that we read the message. In addition to that, often we'll want to try to get to a clear understanding of when a particular text is written. Unlike most of the New Testament texts, this one is the most obscure with that aspect as to when it was written. We have very little internal context to tell us when this was written. And in the first century writings, second century conversation about those texts, there's also very little written telling us when it was written. Not that it was unknown, not that it was not a first century original document, not that it's not authentic. It just wasn't a topic of discussion in great detail in the surviving manuscripts from that era. And as such, we're really kind of having to pay very careful attention and think about what else do we also know about the larger story of Christians to figure out when would it be appropriate for a text like this to have been written and emerge. And so the general answer, if you look at like large lists of hey, when was this written? And the Bible's all kind of laid out that way. The general answer is somewhere in the 60s. That means prior to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem and the city of Jerusalem as a group, but also after some of the major journeys of Paul and his evangelistic work, and there's some gradual maturity taking place amongst local churches. And so this is not written in a context of churches full of new believers. This is ones who could have been impacted by these kinds of messages. And so that pushes our timeline 10 years minimum out from the resurrection of Jesus, and kind of narrows us down to that 20-ish window from 40 to 60, and most folks tend to push this one because of internal tidbits we'll pay attention to in our study, to that later time bracket, 60 to 70. Now that, then, with that kind of assumption, because that's what we're doing there, and we do that a lot in trying to figure out the finer details of these things, that will shift the way we read it. We already would have then had the rise of a kind of a cloud of people that floats away from Jerusalem in advance of its destruction, clinging to Judaism. Because you're going to have folks who are kind of making these strong or strident statements like, you must be circumcised in order to be a Christian, or you must still follow after certain tenets of the old law, or you must follow after our practices that were developed under that law in order to be a Christian. That resulted in the schism dealt with in Galatians, where they're like, these are people from James, is how it's kind of referred to in that text. And Paul gets so involved in trying to correct this that the text says he withstood Peter to his face about this particular issue. So that's kind of saying those things have started to manifest. And so that's something to think about in the backstory of what we have here. Now also, with that, I thought it'd be good for us to have at least one or two different ways to lay out the text. And this is a outline. It is not the outline of Jude. And so whenever you're breaking down these various concepts of like, hey, what's in there? Remember, it's just an outline. Like, I think this is probably what's talked about. This one came from P. Davids, who's written a couple of commentaries over the years, specifically on the text of Jude, and he's got a pretty interesting way to lay it out. I got a second one that I think is important that we'll pay attention to in a second. And we'll define some of these details as we go through the class as well. Jude's not a big book, is it? You know, when we compare it to some of the larger chunks of biblical text, Jude often gets this like, and Jude status, where we'll spend maybe just a few hours, maybe an hour, maybe one Bible class, and say, okay, we've studied Jude. I want us to stop for a second and think about the way in which a piece of literature impacts you. How many of you, not including the Bible or commentaries about the Bible, have either watched the same movie a second time or read the same book a second time? You guys ever done that? Why do we watch a book or a movie? And by the way, if you've watched a Hallmark movie, you've watched the same movie a lot of times.
Not my choice.
That's also correct. But I don't leave the room either, Les. It's like I sit there too.
I just sleep.
Yeah, that's an eventuality. Not the only one sleeping through some of those Hallmark movies. But we do that, right? But why do we do that? Why do we watch it a second time? Some of us forget what went on in the movie. Some of it's just because we liked it. It was enjoyable. Hey, that was a really good movie. There are some movies where I will confess that I've seen at least 20 times. Now, I started watching that movie in 1977, and so to reach 20 times has taken a few years, and it hasn't been exclusively in the theater. But 20 times. You start thinking about that. for a couple-hour movie. I think there's some value in slowing down in some of these smaller biblical texts and being careful and meticulous about it so that we kind of grasp it and realize, hey, when they first got this letter, the first time that the initial recipients received it, it's a big deal. And I say that because in the letter, there are 5 different times in which Jude, in this case, he's dealing with false teachers. Each of these sections are thematic connections that have to deal with false teachers in different ways. And he's making arguments to help them understand how dangerous it is if you depart like those who had gone before, if you behave like those who had dwelt at one point with God and now had left, as the angels were referenced, who had followed after dangerous dreams and thoughts and ideas, or those who would rebel against authority, or those who become dangerous to the local church. Jude does all that. But like we talked about in 1st and 2nd Peter, these are not just theories. Ever have someone come to you and say, hey, let me ask you a hypothetical question. And within like 10 words, you're able to realize that either the hypothetical question is them or one of their friends. Does that, like why did you even do it like a hypothetical thing at that point? Like, just come out and tell me, like, hey, I've got this problem, or you have this problem, or our friend has this problem. Let's get down to business rather than skipping around. Remember, this letter is talking about people they know. It could be family members. It can be friends. It could be neighbors. It could be people that they have traveled with for a year, 2 years. Especially if you remind yourself that travel in the 1st century is not like, hey, we got on the train in London, and in the afternoon we were already gone through the channel and we were in Paris, just a few hours. Like, that's not the case. Like, to travel anywhere, you're actually going on a trip with somebody. They're your buddies for weeks or months. And you get to know someone in those environments. Now, consider that some of them were believers who were traveling together for various reasons, building relationships, who could have also been in this condition. Now they get to worship together. So when we look at this text, make it as personal as you can in the way you carefully read through it and think through how these things impact you. Because that's actually the intent of the Bible's message. It's written to actually take root in us and actually change us or help us. It's not just, hey, here's a break in case of emergency book. Oh, we've got to deal with a false teacher now. Let's break out Jude. No, it should affect us before that ever happens in ways that are forward-looking, maybe corrective, that might even rebuke us in some ways to change the way we think. And so the overall message of the text really is maybe crystallized as a warning that false teachers have the potential to not only undermine the faith of a single believer, but left unchecked, it will affect the entire church. And Jude is the one who, in verse 3, has this phrase that we sometimes co-opt out of its context, and we say that we have a mandate to contend earnestly for the faith, which was once for all delivered unto the saints, in Jude chapter 1 and verse 3. Today, we've got to really latch on to the reality that that's still a thing. There is a faith. It was delivered for all. And you have to actually strive or reach or contend for it. And that's something important for all of us to really grasp in advance of the time when all of a sudden you think you're going to need it. Some of the emphasized areas are deception, dishonesty, disrespect for those who would be in authority. And all of those are because the stakes are not just incrementally high, they begin at a high mark. The contest and the conquest of a soul is really what's at play there. So, how many of you in your past, or even in preparation for this class, took some time to read through Jude as an entire book? You guys read Jude through once before? Yeah, all of us have. Why is that the case? Why is Jude an easy read? Hey, look, the easy answer is the easy answer. It's short, right? It helps us being brief because it stays on topic, it stays on task. If you're like me, the longer something it is, the easier for me is for you to kind of wander off, get the Space Cadet look and go, hey, that's really cool. And I might even keep reading, but my brain has already left the station. We've already kind of shifted onto thinking about that thing. I want to encourage you then, because we're going to be reading through this over the course of, I guess it's like 4 classes, to repeat your reading. Read it often over the course of the next couple weeks. Make it a regular thing, because look, it's not hard, right? Just a few verses. And I think it'll be beneficial. You may also do this. Get a piece of paper or a little notebook. And every day that you read it and sit down and read those verses, write down the thing you learned that day. Today when I read Jude, I noticed or I learned. It's a classic journaling technique that's used to help you understand and remember things, but it will also spark your interest when you come back to it, because the next time you read Jude, you're going to open up that same piece of paper or that journal, and you're going to see what you learned last time, and then you're going to read it again, and you're going to try to add something new to it this time. You will find that in doing that simple thing, not only will you keep track of your progress, but you'll probably remember Jude better over the course of the series of classes, because you've created your own framework of important information. And it doesn't matter how you lay it out. You don't have to use a fancy book for it. A piece of paper or a sticky note will do. You can use your phone or whatever. But the process really does that. Before I get into some of the thematic connections and the way it interacts with the other parts of the New Testament, you guys have any questions or thoughts or things that you've noticed, things of import in your reading of Jude or the text itself? Norris?
To me, what stands out to me in verse 3 when he said his faith was delivered once for the saints. And I think that's a key thing for us, because we hear people talking about faith, and it just this broad thing, but people got different definitions of it, but his faith for Christians was delivered one time.
Yeah. A lot of times that verse 3 in particular, we use as a boundary text in light of our thoughts about the biblical canon. That's the sum total of inspired scriptures, and how it impacts narrowly in the space of what Jesus wants us to know. And we'll include it with Paul's teaching in the letters to the churches at Corinth, the church at Corinth, and say, hey, Paul says there that right now this is the circumstance. You've got spiritual gifts, but a time is coming, a moment will arrive when those gifts will not be there anymore, and it will be superseded by love. And so we think, hey, no more gifts, that means no more inspired speakers. And so we then connect, hey, there's going to be an end to someone writing additional letters. We link that together with what Jude says here in in Jude 1:3, and say, hey, here's Jude summing the same thing and saying, hey, this faith is unique in its delivery. So there's a one of it. And that's a pretty good, reasonable conclusion. By the way, it's shared by most Christian communities that have the same convictions about the text. There's very few that would say there's inspired people today. So that conviction is not weird. In fact, it's rational and reasonable. It's right to do that. But we also, like Norris is kind of identifying, need to make one more application of it. It's not just that the canon is complete, or that there is a reduction of what you read and say this is what Jesus said, is that there is a singularity of faith, that believers should be united, because that's the implied context of you contend for it. That you're actually making a decision that there are people who claim to be following Christ that aren't. And that's a first century situation and a 21st century situation that we all have to work with and say, hey, look, I'm contending for what Jesus declared and what his disciples followed. And not only do I want you to follow it, I also need you to give up these erroneous ideas or these false doctrines. And that's implied in this sense of once delivered. And it's indicated in the little category here of dangerous dreams that I've got referenced up there, that there are those who have come up with ideas that are just simply not accurate. Some are just fanciful tales. Here's my classic illustration. I can't remember the kid's name, but do you guys remember the news? There was this kid who had claimed that when in the hospital he had died and come back, and he had this whole fanciful tale of what it was like in that brief moment when his bodily organs had stopped functioning for a little bit and then they kicked back on. You guys remember that story? Here's the interesting thought. If you follow up the story, you can go and look in the news articles. Eventually it was revealed that most of those ideas were fanciful tales he'd made up. And some of them had actually come from his family members. And the power of notoriety was so enticing, and the money, that they sold the tale and kept selling it for as long as they could. It's not just a first century thing where people make up things in order to get notoriety or interest. It's an all century thing. And Jude here in text is helping us realize that, hey, that happens. And most specifically, happens amongst Christians too. We've probably seen it happen outside of theological or biblical concerns. But no, it happens amongst Christians when they're talking about the Bible too. Sometimes folks just make up stuff in order to make their opinion stronger. Les?
I guess the one thing that several years ago heightened my interest in reading the book of Jude and also the book of James is it's thought that he was probably the half-brother of Jesus, and also James, the half-brother of Jesus.
Yeah.
And that, when I once saw that, it heightened my interest in, because I know there's other scripture that talk about, I think Jesus really had a hard time convincing his family of who he really was. And it just impressed me that once these two, Jude and James, accepted it, they wholeheartedly.
Yeah. And that's the most likely conclusion, that he is half-brother status is how we tend to think of this in context. And realize that's us looking at the very limited information we have, but it's the most sensible answer. And so when you connect that to someone who would have had a childhood of some length with the Son of God and all of the things that would have made that unique. Not only just Jesus, which is massive, but how that also would have affected Mary, that would have affected Joseph, that would have affected Elizabeth, John, the entire interaction between those two as it played out, and his presence there. Realize that a lot of the work of the disciples, the apostles, took place around their community. The distance, by the way, between, say, Bethlehem and the fishing village of Peter is maybe a day and a half walking distance in some contexts. Or you can get on a boat and just sail across in a few hours. So this is not like going from Jerusalem to Rome. This is a day's journey, day and a half in some cases, from some of these places to one to another. So constant interaction with all the impacts of the work of Christ is there as well. So that should shift our perspective too. Anyone else have some other insights? Rich first, then Norris.
referencing events that happened a long time ago.
Yeah.
I mean, going back as far as Cain. And so that's going back pretty far.
Yeah.
So it does a couple things. I think it helps reinforce God's plan and using scenarios that will help them remind them of what Jude is talking about, and help connect it. I mean, the other part is that it validates that those were real people and being referenced at this time when Jude is writing them. That's their history, and that's legit.
Yeah, as you're reading through, a lot of Bibles at times will have small sub-footnotes that say, hey, this verse or this segment. Make sure you make note of that in your own little notes and say, hey, this is that. Hand write down the reference or go read the other passage after you read through Jude. Norris?
Yeah, I was just going to say, to me, that part it reminds me of throughout the Bible, how the Apostle Paul warn us and remind us of being careful, like we said, about false teachings and those things like that we always have to, as a church and individual, we always have to be on guard, because this faith and our salvation is priceless, and we should guard against it, because if we allow people to take away from us, that's something valuable that we have as Christians. And I think about in Ephesians where he talks about telling people, don't be tossed to and fro by every wind of doctrine, by the trickery of men. So, this is something, just like we said, it's a short book, but it's real powerful.
Yeah, I tend to kind of do this in my head. I position Jude in the date of writing in between 1st and 2nd Peter. I kind of view them as sandwich texts. We don't know for sure. I kind of look at them as sandwich texts, that there's a lot of interdependence of ideas between those two books. And so even more specifically, if you're going to say which two are closest related, well, it's definitely 2 Peter and Jude. You'll note 2 Peter 1, or chapter 2 that is, verses 1 through 18 really match well from verses 4 and through 13 of Jude. And then chapter 3, verses 2 and 3 of 2 Peter really tie into the last closing parts of Jude. So there's a lot of really strong links there. And you remember when we summarized 2 Peter, how we pointed out that text, unlike 1 Peter, just reminds us of various parts of the Old Testament story. Jude basically does that too. He reminds us of it. He doesn't quote extensively from the Old Testament. He uses the images, the literary style, the pictures, the events of history to teach us things. Also, he challenges us. Jude challenges our understanding and perspective of the spiritual realm because of his decision to include what kind of creature? Yeah, he talks about divine beings, right? Talks about it in a very specific way. And every time that happens in the New Testament, and to a lesser degree in the Old Testament, we don't always get much. And we certainly don't get enough information to know the whole story, right? We get like this little hint of things. And he says stuff at times, both he and Paul, and he doesn't give us a citation per se that we can go and say, well, I was talking about Genesis chapter 2. I was talking about Genesis chapter 11. None of that happens. So that means we have to actually put on our thinking cap and use the scraps of evidence we have from the Old Testament to try to get a hint of what might be going on with angels. Broadly, remember, angels is a word that simply means, both Old Testament and New Testament, a messenger. But angels can be, these messengers, spiritual beings, distinctly different than humans. But an angel could be a messenger in other contexts, something else. But in this case, we're talking about these spiritual beings, distinct from humanity, that seem to have a slightly different rule set. Because what does Jesus say regarding angels and marital status?
In heaven,
something like a whole different set of rules for marriage. They don't marry. A different rule set. Because the rule set that exists for humanity upon earth, and by the way, even in the garden, was pairing. You're joined together. There's a bonding that takes place, whether it is God serving as the source of their pairing or bonding, or humans, bond. It's the normal case. It's so normal that when it's not the case, the Bible makes specific comments about it in different ways. They chose this, or it was for a time period, or because of the distress. Or everyone else assumed they would, and like Jesus, he says, no, I've got a different perspective or purpose. I'm serving a different role. I will be married, but not like you think I will be. So that's important to pay attention to, because there's some of these instances in Jude we're going to have to think about, hey, what does that mean? You ever talk, here's another point that's kind of connected to it that I think will help us prepare. You ever sit down and talk to somebody about the nature of sin and rebellion, and they ask a question like, why did God allow us to sin? Why do we have sin in the world? Why doesn't he just make it so that there's no bad things? You ever have someone talk about that with you? Do you struggle to find good answers to that question? The answer is, I do. You can, if you don't struggle to answer those questions, awesome. Keep at it. Keep doing good. But this is what I note from this. That problem of figuring out the parents of evil in the creation isn't just a humanity problem. Because divine and or other spiritual beings struggle with the choice to rebel too. It's not just a human thing. There is an aspect, and here's my answer to the question, of having free will, independent thought, that has to include a choice that says, I don't want to do what God said. Independent of that is no longer free will. It's gone at that point. If there's some sort of boundary that says, yeah, you can do what you want, but you just can't do these things. You're no longer choosing. And then it also then restructures the way we think about any good choice you make. Because then they're just as corrupted by our inability to say no if only choices available to us are just yes to good. Free will is a big part of the answer that I give to that Campbell question. It's just how it is. And it's not just us, it's spiritual beings as well. They got and get to continue to choose until a point where they don't, where it's settled. Something to think about. All right, so with that, with our kind of thoughts through the text here, it's important to recognize that then with our setting kind of close as a sister book to 2 Peter, it's right for us to think about issues specifically of whatever is going on in Gnosticism and what that word means, and we'll talk about it, how that affects first century believers, how it still affects us today, how we balance our thoughts regarding the conflict between the spirit and the flesh as God taught us, but also recognizing what the sovereign nature of God is. Like, how does God function as king with us as free will servants? Because God's sovereignty is certainly in play here when Jude begins to bring out pictures of divine beings who are not us, but have some similarity to us. And so there's going to be discussion in the text of being called, being loved, what it means to be kept by God. What does his power do? And what do we do with those who believe but don't act like believers? You ever struggle with that in your individual relationships where you have someone who says, and you believe that this is accurate, that they believe in God, but their life doesn't look like it? Now, have you ever stood in the mirror and recognized that the person you're talking about is you? That's a tough thing that's going on in this text, because you have people who, in Jude's audience space, absolutely believe in God the Father, the Spirit, and Christ as the Son of God. But they have adopted or created ideas that go contrary to the teaching of that same Godhead or God family. And it then plays out in their lives. Or, and this is hinted at somewhat here, they may not have any new ideas regarding God, but they've adopted all the bad behaviors of believers over the centuries. And what do we do with them? How do we handle them? It's not as simple as we want it to be, right? Some of the stuff is incredibly challenging to source out. There was a time, especially in my youth, where I thought the answer was, well, certainly all we got to do is withdraw from all the bad people in the congregation, and all of a sudden things are great. Does that actually work that way? Does biblical discipline just magically make the group perfect? It can and does help when applied as intended. But it is not the only biblical solution to people growing through spiritual challenges and difficulties and sin and repentance and all that stuff. And it doesn't deal uniquely with some of the other complications that come up. Because there are other biblical passages that tell you how to deal with a different kind of problem. Rejecting a factious person is different than disciplining a member of a congregation who is engaged in ongoing sexual immorality. Those are wildly different things, handled in wildly different ways. And that's different from dealing with someone who is new in Christ and simply doesn't know. So now you have three potentially moral problems that have three different solutions, that have three different timelines. And so it's far more complicated. So dealing with that is super important. Because note this. Paul writes to that church at Corinth who has that specific familial family problem with sexual immorality inside that household. And at that point, even though that problem is still in the middle of them, he doesn't write that right now grace is being perverted in your congregations to such an extent that everything's lost. Jude, though, writes about the impact of these messages of being able to overthrow the entire church at a faster rate. But here's the thing. I suspect that sometimes we don't pay attention to some of these theological issues as soon as we should, and we get so ensnared by immorality that we can see and think that's the bigger problem. When they're both problems, they have impacts that we have to pay attention to, and we've got to work them out. So dealing with that is actually part of Jude, of figuring out how do we not only handle some of it, but understand the nuances in a way to pick out the problems in a proper and a healthy manner. Good time for us to slide into our standardized, formalized questions here. But we're going to go in reverse order. So we're going to ask our fifth question first and mess with the sequence a little bit. What do you think God is teaching us in Jude in one sentence or less? Because you can use one or two words. I don't know, that would be a sentence, right? If it's just one or two words, if it's grammatically proper. So at least one sentence. What's God teaching us here? Short version.
Be on guard.
Be on guard. I'll repurpose a phrase I used a couple weeks ago. False teachers are a real thing. What else? Another way?
Like the first half of verse 21, keep yourselves in the love of God.
Yeah. That actually is the dichotomy of the text, that in presence is in or within the boundaries of God's love and what that would entail. You can think about it in the same way that Paul writes about being baptized into Christ. You die with Christ. When he writes to the Galatians, how you're in Christ at that point. When he writes to Colossians, you're translated into Christ. And Jude uses phraseology that says, within the love of God, to in essence mean the same thing, the same space.
Self-examination.
What was that?
Self-examination.
There's a sense of self-examination that has to go through, an internal processing here. Do we learn anything about Jesus or God from Jude? I can rephrase it. What do we learn about Jesus and God from Jude? Both those answers work. God actually cares about us in a unique way. He cares about our decision to follow him and how that decision manifests. God cares about us uniquely, and God is jealous. There's a sense of spiritual jealousy that's taking place here, that God cares that you don't leave the fold in that sense. What does Jude teach us about people?
We forget.
Yeah, we forget about it because he pulls through deep parts, the B-side deep tracks of Israel, and pulls stuff up and says, hey, pay attention. This is not new. And we do the same thing. We forget about first century challenges and act like they have no relevance to 21st century life when there's the same story on repeat. Number two, do you have questions you want answered about stuff that Jude mentions? I'm going to say 100%, and we'll deal with a lot of it as we go through the text. Gary?
I've heard it said that the love feast in verse 12 is the Lord's Supper. Have you heard it like that?
Some people will suggest that. I don't think that's the case. I think grammatically what's going on there is it's a metaphor for the shared community of love in the first century church, and they're coming in like dogs to eat on it. I do understand the grammatical reasons why some would make that connection, but it's not the same terminology that the New Testament writers use elsewhere to describe the Lord's Supper. And contextually, there are other tidbits that don't play there. If we make that the case and say that's the Lord's Supper there, then we've got some other theological problems to deal with. Historically, the churches you and I have, as a group, have been associated with, do not practice, in essence, closed communion. We don't examine somebody else before they partake. In the first communion service that took place at Cane Ridge, which is part of the American Restoration Movement, that was a Scots Presbyterian group. They actually practiced closed communion. So they examined every single person over the course of a few days theologically to see if they were suitable to take the Lord's Supper together in their annual observance of the Lord's Supper at that event. So that's what a closed communion looks like, where you're actually literally saying, I've examined your theology, I've examined your spiritual life, you can have that. So that would be the implication if we thought that this was the Lord's Supper, that we would have to then do that for everybody. But for those who serve in the Lord's Supper, if a visitor comes in, do you ask them ahead of time if they're going to partake in the supper and say, hey, what do you believe about the incarnation of Christ? Is that a question we ask them? So we don't actually practice a closed communion. And most of the folks who make the argument about this text being the Lord's Supper also don't practice a closed communion. There's very few Christian groups in the 21st century that even do.
We're told to examine ourselves.
Yeah. Actually, the emphasis is put internally to make sure you're right. That's it for time this morning. Sorry for the long trek down into academia there for a second, but appreciate the questions and the conversation. Thanks, everybody.